Everybody, it's good to see some new faces. I've been doing these for advanced staff for a while, but I always see some familiar faces, but it's always good to see some new ones. My name is Tony Golden. I'm a partner in the Garg Golden Law Firm. My practice focuses on labor and employment law and representing employers. And so today we're going to talk about conducting an investigation. And even though this is the scenario here is sort of geared toward a harassment investigation, the same principles apply to any sort of internal investigation you might need to conduct involving employees. I love questions. This is geared toward audience participation, so feel free to jump in at any time and ask away, or just tell me I don't know what I'm talking about. That's fine too. So let's start with a little bit of background before we get into the nitty-gritty. So background-wise, what's your obligation as an employer? Okay. In general, you want to have a policy, written policy, preferably in your handbook, that is a reasonable policy prohibiting unlawful harassment and discrimination, that also has some sort of mechanism for reporting claims of harassment and discrimination. And as most of these policies you'll see, you want to make sure that the reporting part of it allows for reporting to more than just one person, right? Because the issue can oftentimes be the supervisor might be the one doing the harassing, right? So you want to make sure that you can report to maybe the supervisor and HR and an executive or something like that. Investigation. So if you do get a harassment complaint, you want to conduct a thorough and complete investigation and reach a reasonable conclusion. That's sort of the part we're going to focus on today. Take action. So if you do find in your investigation that there was unlawful harassment or discrimination, you need to take appropriate remedial action that's reasonably calculated to prohibit future harassment or discrimination. So that could take a lot of different forms. It doesn't necessarily mean firing the employee the accused employee. It might just be discipline, it might be a suspension, something like that. But it has to be reasonably calculated to prevent future harassment or discrimination. And then you always want to document. Documentation is critical, especially by the time I get involved, because that gives me all the background I need if you need my help or someone like me to respond to an EEOC charge, for example, or defend in a lawsuit. You want to make sure that you have complete and thorough documentation, and please try to make it as legible as possible. Oftentimes I see tons of handwritten notes from interviews and meetings, and it's great that you got a bunch of notes and that they're thorough and all that, but if no one can read them, they don't do us a lot of good. So if they are kind of scratched out and only you can understand them, then it's a good idea to type them up, but don't destroy those original handwritten copies either. Okay, so let's talk about some basics on harassment, and this will kind of launch us into the detailed discussion on conducting an investigation. So oftentimes when we're talking about harassment, we're talking about sexual harassment. And there are two kinds. There's quid pro quo harassment, which is sleep with me and I'll give you a promotion kind of harassment. And there is hostile work environment harassment, which is comments, offensive touching, things like that create a hostile work environment. Hostile work environment could be related to more than just sexual harassment. It could be any sort of protected class, race, disability, age, all of those are protected areas that could result in harassment. So when we're talking about a hostile work environment, we're talking, here's the legal definition, unwanted and offensive conduct of a, pick your protected class, nature, that was severe or pervasive enough to change the conditions of employment and create an objectively and subjectively abusive environment. When we're talking about changing the conditions of employment, what that means typically is the employee being harassed is not able to perform their duties, or their duties have changed in some way because of the harassment. Or maybe their pay has been affected in some way because of the harassment, things like that. The standard is objective and subjective, which means if a court is looking at this, it's going to say, well, would the reasonable person find this conduct to be abusive or offensive, right? But then also you're looking at subjectively, did this particular plaintiff find the conduct abusive or offensive? And oftentimes, when we do an investigation, we kind of learn, well, let's say it's name calling, harassment, and it involves name calling, and it's based on, I don't know, age or race or something like that. Well, a lot of times the accuser or the complainant will have participated in that conduct as well. And so as an employer, that's good evidence that the conduct was not subjectively offensive to that complainant because they were involved in it also. Okay, so now let's get into, with that background, what I did was I crafted a scenario for us to walk through. And this is going to kind of give us the meat and potatoes of what our investigation is going to be about. So let's meet our cast of characters. We've got Brian, who is a 62-year-old male vice president, senior vice president of sales, has been with the company, and for our purposes, doesn't matter what kind of company, has been with the company for 30 plus years and is a perennial rainmaker for the company. So he brings in a lot of money, he's been there 30 plus years, senior VP of sales. We have Nancy, 28-year-old attractive female, hired about 9 months ago and on Brian's sales team. Okay? And we have you, and for this case, we want you to play the role of a vice president of human resources. You're going to be the one conducting the investigation. You've been with the company 15 years at least, and you know Brian very well, having been there so long at the same time. And we have Michelle, who is the company president. All right. So here's how things get started. You and Brian are meeting with Nancy to terminate her employment because in the 9 months she's been with the company, she's lost 2 major accounts. Okay? As soon as Nancy gets the inkling she's about to be fired, she says, Brian, is this because I ended things with you? All right. So that raises some questions, right? And it's always right around when you're about to fire an employee that something comes up. Either they suddenly develop a disability or other medical condition, or they were harassed, or something happened, right? Usually it's even before the meeting to terminate them, because most of the time they kind of see things coming, and so they'll come up with some excuse beforehand. All right, so you start as the HR representative. Now you're thinking about potential legal issues that might be involved in this. Is there quid pro quo harassment? Was there? Did Brian kind of pressure her into this situation and saying that it's in exchange for some advancement in the company? Is there retaliation for ending the relationship? Why does Brian want to fire her? He says it's because we lost 2 major accounts. Is that accurate? How have we treated other people who have lost accounts? That's an important thing to consider. Is this a hostile work environment? Has Brian been going around making comments, things that other people might have overheard, that sort of thing? Was it a consensual relationship and maybe just bad judgment by Brian with someone on his team, a subordinate on his team? Now, in addition to some of the legal issues, you want to think about the business issues, right? Because you're running a business, so it's not just what's lawful or unlawful, it's, well, how's this going to affect our bottom line as a business? Is there going to be a lawsuit? That's expensive. Are there ways to prevent that? Decreased morale. You know, if you've got your senior vice president of sales undergoing a harassment investigation, or you've got complaints about him, is that going to affect everyone else on his team, potentially? Loss of one or more valued employees. Is the situation so bad you're going to have to fire Brian, who's one of the top performers and brings in a lot of money for the company? Are you going to have to get rid of Nancy if her performance is still bad, or maybe her performance wasn't bad? Maybe it's related to the harassment, and otherwise she would have performed just fine. So where do we go from here? What do you think? Should we proceed with firing Nancy? Yes? No? Maybe? Come on, at least one yes.
Yeah, get rid of her.
Yeah. Right? So switch to investigation mode. Probably the thing you ought to do, right? So,
Tony.
Yes.
Give him your card.
He knows where to find it. So the investigation. All right, so we're switching to investigation mode. This is sort of a choose your own adventure, except I'm going to tell you which way we're doing here. So you're still in the room with Nancy and, that should be Brian and Nancy. Still in the room with Brian and Nancy.
Why are you in with them, both of them at the same time is what I want to know.
Well, remember, this started out because you were both in the room, you were going to fire Nancy. Okay. And that's when she made the comment. So Brian, I apologize for the name mistake. I had switched this around a few times, and so anyway, this is Brian. Brian insists on wanting to meet you privately first, and talk to you privately. Is that a good idea, to meet with him privately? Probably not right off the bat. You know, maybe get a little more information. You tell him you'll meet with him in due course. And you tell Nancy to come back in an hour, and you're going to discuss things and get more information from her. You remind her that the company takes allegations of harassment very seriously, and that you're going to conduct a thorough investigation. Now, that sort of language should already be in your employee handbook, or if you have a separate harassment or discrimination policy, it should already be in there, because you want to make it clear any sort of complaint of harassment or discrimination is treated seriously and will be investigated. Yeah?
Why wouldn't you meet with him privately? If he asks, would you stop the whole scenario right then and say, if he says, can I meet with you privately, then you say yes, and you ask her, can you wait outside and I will meet with you as soon as we're done?
Right.
When
We'll get to why you shouldn't meet with him privately. There's a little more history here. That's a good question. In general, that may not be a problem, right? But here it's going to be. So this is a good time to point out that oftentimes you'll hear someone make a complaint, you have an employee make a complaint, and they will say, well, I don't want to make a formal complaint, or I don't want to get anyone in trouble, I don't want to, I just want to tell you this is going on. Okay? Well, as an employer, there's no such thing as a formal or informal complaint. All complaints of harassment or discrimination need to be taken seriously and investigated. Now, sometimes you get that person who just complains about everything. Every little slight, every little thing is harassment or discrimination, even if it doesn't amount to something unlawful. In that situation, you can start taking things with a grain of salt as you've investigated a few of them and nothing comes of it. Then you have to deal with that employee, and they're essentially over-complaining about things that are not unlawful. But for the most part, any complaint should be treated the same, whether the person says they want it to be a formal complaint or not. Okay, so you meet with Nancy, and you have your HR manager there, or some other third party. You always want to have a third person in the room. One, because it's good for someone else to be taking notes, so you're not trying to write everything down while you're talking to the person. And also too, because you don't want to get into a he said, she said type of scenario with regard to what happened at that meeting. You assure her that there shouldn't be any fear of retaliation, which should be something in your policy anyway. And so Nancy tells you that soon after she started working for the company, she and Brian were on a business trip. Both of them were drinking, and they ended up sleeping together. After that, he would make sexual comments about her around the office, telling her how good her butt looked, etc. They rendezvoused a couple more times outside of the office until Nancy finally ended things with Brian. So here are some questions that we might want to ask Nancy. And these questions are good for any type of investigation, right? Not just a sexual harassment investigation. Did Brian ever threaten you about your job? Okay, so that's gonna tell us, is there some sort of quid pro quo harassment going on? If the answer is yes, if he said, well, we're gonna fire you unless you have this relationship with me, that would be quid pro quo harassment. Did Brian pressure you into the relationship? Did he use his position of authority into saying, you know, you must have a relationship with me? That's also quid pro quo harassment. What was the worst comment Brian made? And this is a good question to ask. It's good to ask these sort of extreme questions. What was the worst? What was the most severe? Things like that, because it allows you to put a box around the outlying, you know, sort of extent of the claim. So let's say, you know, if the worst comment he ever made was, you look pretty today, well, that's not terrible, right? And so if now later on she goes and files an EEOC charge and says, well, he told me all this, you know, the worst comment he made was all the sexual stuff, well, you've already got her committing in your investigation to, hey, the worst comment he made was something fairly benign. Did any other employees overhear any of the comments or witness any physical contact? So it's important to figure out whether there are any witnesses to any of the events at issue, because as part of your investigation, if there are witnesses, you're going to need to follow up with those witnesses and find out any information that they have. Are there any emails, text messages, photos, or anything else like that related to the relationship with Brian? What sort of physical evidence is there in addition to just what she's saying or what he's saying? This is, I mean, I don't have to tell you, text messages, you know, social media posts, instant messages, things like that are usually now where you find a ton of evidence, either for or against your stance as the employer. For example, I just helped a client with an EEOC charge where the employee was complaining that her boss was not allowing her to attend doctor's appointments with her daughter and attend school functions and things like that. And you've got a whole series of text messages where the boss was saying, yeah, go ahead, go to that event, you know, take the time off, that's fine, approving all this time off in text messages. I mean, there's no way she could say that, you know, that wasn't true. So, any other questions you might ask?
Timeline.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Figure out
When
when
did it
this
happen?
started.
How long ago did it quit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good idea. Anything else? All right. Well, that kind of, you know, you're going to want to get into the details as you're talking with the person. When you're doing any sort of investigation, no matter who you're interviewing, you're not just asking questions, you're also assessing their credibility. So, you know, in this scenario, you've known Brian a long time, so when you talk with him, you already have sort of a preconceived notion of whether he's telling the truth or not. Nancy's only been with the company a short time, and if you're in HR, you may or may not have interacted with her much at all. So you're going to have to assess her veracity and see whether you find her credible. So Nancy tells you there were no threats about her job, but she felt a bit pressured because Brian was a senior, or is a senior manager, and she was new. She can't recall any specific comments, just a general comment about the but she never noticed other employees overhear them or see them interact. And she says there are no emails, texts, or photos. As Nancy is talking, you notice that the pen in front of her is kind of large for a normal pen. And you ask her, what is it? She tells you it's a recorder pen, and she's been recording the conversation this whole time. What should you do about that? What do you think? Throw it. Just grab it, run away. That's right. Destroy it. What do you think? So, a comment was brought up this morning, which I think is important to note, and that's you should assume in any interview like this, in any conversation, it's being recorded. Unfortunately, it's all too easy these days to record a conversation, right? And in Nevada, if you are in person, are you recording? No. In Nevada, if you are in person in an interview or an in-person meeting, you only need one-party consent to record a conversation. So the consent can be from the person doing the recording. So you don't have to even inform the other person that you're recording the conversation. Now, if you're over the telephone, Nevada law requires consent from each person on the phone because it involves unlawful wiretapping. So that's a little different. But what should you do with the recording with the pen? Should you tell her, okay, that's fine, just take it with you when you go? Any thoughts? Yeah.
Is it part of the investigation now? Can you take it?
Well, so here's the thing. You can't force her to give it to you. The best you can probably do is ask her for a copy of what she's recorded so far. Ask her not to record anything in the future, if that's your position. Some employers like recording these meetings. I'm not a big fan of that because you might say something you shouldn't have and then it's on recording verbatim. I think it's better to rely on the person taking notes as long as they're a good, thorough note taker. So I would ask her for a copy of it, so you have a copy of it as well. Ask her not to record any further, and that's about the best you can do.
Before you start any meetings with employees, can you just say, I'm not giving permission for you to record any of this?
You can.
Would that, and even if they still do, even if you say it, can that be thrown out, or?
No, so like I said, because Nevada law allows only one-party consent if you're in person.
Even if you make it clear?
Doesn't matter.
Oh.
Yep, you can say that.
I think if you make it clear that you don't want her to record it before it even came up, you're sort of saying, whatever I'm going to tell you
might be problematic.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it might be.
Like I feel like you're just opening in something
right.
that you wouldn't want
So
to.
you can say that, and there's nothing wrong with saying that necessarily, but you can't force it to happen. If they want to record it, they end up recording it, fine. The thing you can do is say, we don't allow recordings of investigative interviews, and if you insist on recording, then we're going to have to stop the interview. And if the complainant says, well, I'm only going to record this, I insist on recording it, what you can do is say, well, then you're not cooperating with the investigation and we're not going to be able to do much more here because you're not providing us the information that we need.
And that's not a slight on the employer's behalf?
No, I mean, you can do that, and it's perfectly okay to have a policy that you can't record investigative interviews. Now, I will say there are some NLRB cases, National Labor Relations Board cases, where if we're talking about something that affects wages, hours, and working conditions, and there's concerted activity. So for example, let's say, forget the whole scenario so far. Let's say Nancy comes to you saying, me and my whole team think we're being paid far too low, and we need to be paid more, and we're going to go organize if we're not paid what we think we're owed. And in that one-on-one conversation, she records it, and the company has a policy that says you can't record interviews or something like that, right? The NLRB would say that's an unlawful policy because she's engaged in concerted activity. She's allowed to record. But back to our scenario here. So finishing up our meeting with Nancy, thank her for her information, assure her again that you're going to continue your investigation, And you will get back to her with any additional questions, and if she has any additional information, she should come to you. So one final question you might ask Nancy, and most of the time I like this question, but you gotta assess the scenario of who you're talking to, is what do you think a fair outcome will be? Now if she says, well, Brian should be fired. Okay, well maybe not, depends on the circumstances. So if she says, well, all I want is to be transferred to another team, well, that might be a reasonable outcome, right? And that's not necessarily too difficult a thing to do. You still might have to deal with the performance deficiency issue, but now if you ask that question and she says something like, I just want to transfer to another team, if you don't fire Brian later on, it would be hard for her to dispute that that was not a reasonable outcome. So some key points about our meeting with Nancy. Quid pro quo.
Just a minute
Yeah.
before you go on. So are you saying if she suggests what she feels is a reasonable outcome and you agree, you need to do that? Or
You don't need to do that. You still have to
I mean, it would be advisable, I understand, but what would be the repercussions if you decide it's not in the company's best interest to
Right.
do that?
So as long as you can support after your investigation, whatever action you take is reasonable under the
Okay.
circumstances, that's your obligation. Okay. But if you end up deciding to do what she asked for, it would be hard for her to come back and say that's unreasonable.
Yeah.
Right?
Got it.
So she said she wasn't pressured, so that's good. It sort of knocks quid pro quo harassment out of the box. Hostile work environment, again, she said she wasn't pressured. She couldn't remember any specific comments from Brian. You know, maybe there weren't any comments around the office, that sort of thing. There were no witnesses and no other evidence of the relationship. What do you do with the recording? We talked about that. So now you're going to meet with Brian to get his side of the story. You, again, want to have a third party in the room with you. Brian keeps asking you, well, what did Nancy tell you? What did she tell you? Now, should you tell him what she said? Not necessarily verbatim. You want to make sure that Brian has enough information so that he can reasonably respond to the allegations against him. And typically in your questioning, when you start asking him about things, he'll be able to decipher kind of what Nancy said. But there's no reason to just overtly say, she said X, what's your response to it? She said Y, what's your response to it? Things are a little bit different. Do we have any public sector employers? Okay. So things are, just so you know, a little bit different in the public sector where employers are subject to due process rights, constitutional due process. Employees are covered by that. So an investigation and things like this happen a little bit differently. Brian insists it was a consensual relationship, that he was just being stupid, but he did not take advantage of Nancy. He shows you a photo that they took together in a hotel room, clothed, thankfully, that Nancy framed and gave to Brian so he would remember the time they had together. Okay? So what's problematic about that as far as Nancy's information goes? Right, no photos, nothing, no text, no photos, nothing, right? So this kind of goes toward assessing her credibility. Was she lying? Did she just not remember? Maybe she didn't remember, although she took the time to print it out, have it developed, put it in a frame and give it to him. So it's unlikely she didn't remember. You asked Brian about any comments he made around the office, and he says he would comment to her when no one else was around because they were seeing each other. And lastly, Brian also tells you when she ended it, he was sad, but he never threatened her. And the issues about her performance are independent of her relationship with him. Okay, so that's an important point, and it's something you kind of have to see whether your investigation bears that out. Because if you do want to take any disciplinary action against Nancy for the performance deficiencies, you better be very certain there's a lot of objective evidence that the performance problems had nothing to do with this relationship with Brian. Okay.
So at this point, would you then ask Brian to clarify on performance issues and ask the question,
Sure.
is this equivalent to what has happened in the past with other employees
Yeah.
similar?
Well, and hopefully you will have done that, because remember already, this started out with you being in a meeting ready to fire Nancy for her performance problems. So hopefully you already know, okay, we have had other people with similar performance issues and we fired them, rather than just giving them a warning or something like that. Or not, and in which case maybe you shouldn't have been in that meeting trying to fire her. Okay, some key points from Brian's meeting. So far the evidence still suggests it was a consensual relationship, so that's good. There don't seem to be any other witnesses. No one was offended by Brian's comments, so if no one overheard anything, no one saw anything, that helps eliminate possible other harassment claims, because witnessing a senior manager harassing a subordinate could cause some other claims to pop up, right? Did Nancy lie about there not being any photos? Again, that's something you're going to have to determine whether that makes her less credible. Maybe she just forgot. Can we believe Brian that wanting to fire Nancy had nothing to do with the performance issues? Again, that's a credibility assessment. You'll have to decide that based on the information and based on your knowledge of how truthful it tends to be. So, you decide to have a private meeting with Brian. Okay? He insists again that you meet privately. So, in that private meeting, Brian reminds you of a time 2 years ago that you were accused of something by another employee, and Brian helped you out of the situation. Okay? So that's not great for our investigation. So now what do you do? Right? Is the investigation compromised?
Yes.
Maybe. It could be. You have to assess, now it's one of those circumstances where you kind of have to step outside yourself and look at the 10,000-foot view and say, all right, has my objectivity been compromised? Brian brought this up. Am I more likely to side with him because he helped me out in the past? How would this look to the EEOC if they learned about it? How would this look in front of a jury if they learned about it? That sort of thing. Some possible options. You can proceed with the investigation as planned. Maybe have your HR manager conduct the investigation instead with another third party, sitting in on any meetings. Or hire an outside third party to conduct the investigation. Whether you hire an outside third party might depend on whether you have enough of a team internally who's not connected with the issue to do the investigation going forward. If that's the case, that's fine. If you think there are too many compromised aspects of it, it might be worth hiring an outside third party to complete the investigation. All right, so what you decide to do is you meet with Michelle, the company president, and tell her what's going on. She can't believe Brian was being so stupid, but she does remind you how valuable an employee he is based on the revenue that he generates, right? That's always a consideration. We are running a for-profit company. So you also tell her that Brian reminded you of the scenario where he helped you out when you were being investigated. Okay. So Michelle thinks that is sufficiently unrelated and for you to just handle the situation. Okay. So we're not going to worry about whether the investigation is compromised. Company president's okay with it. All right, handle it. She suggests maybe offering Nancy a severance agreement. What do you think about that? Is that a good idea? Maybe, maybe not. So what I would typically like to see is let's complete the investigation, figure out what our potential exposure is, and then maybe decide whether a severance agreement is appropriate. You don't want to do that necessarily right off the bat. because then she could take that severance agreement over to the EEOC and say, look, they didn't even conduct an investigation. They just tried to buy me off and, kick me out the door, right? So, assess the scenario. It's going to be different from situation to situation. Okay, so from our meeting with the boss, we were directed, at least implicitly, protect the valuable asset, which is Brian. So you can decide whether that's appropriate or not. Maybe a severance agreement. Handle it. I'm sure we've all heard that. Just deal with it. Right? Make it go away. So let's talk about some of the legal issues. Harassment based on the relationship. Right now, it seems like her claim is pretty thin, right? It seems like overall it was a consensual relationship. She ended things with him. Probably the major hurdle at this point is the performance and the reason we wanted to fire her sufficiently unrelated to the relationship that we can say it's a separate issue, it's independent, and either proceed with terminating her because of performance or do something else in that regard. We also have to be careful about a retaliation claim because I'll talk about that. So her complaint about Brian is a protected activity, and retaliation is when you give an employee an adverse employment action for engaging in a protected activity. So regardless of whether the underlying harassment claim has any merit, let's assume it doesn't, but you still fire her, now she could say, well, the only reason you fired me was because I complained about Brian. Well, the good thing in that regard for us is, well, we were already in a meeting about to fire you when you made the complaint. So the decision to terminate employment preceded the complaint, so there wouldn't be sufficient connection for retaliation claim there. If harassment occurred, like we discussed, your obligation is to take prompt and effective remedial action. Any claims by Brian? What if we discipline him or do something with him? Could he have any claims? Probably not. It would be a little tough, but we would want to determine, just like we should have with Nancy, how have we treated anyone else in his situation? Okay. Have there been any other harassment claims by senior management? Brian reminded us of him helping us out in a similar situation. How were we treated in that situation? So that's something that could affect whether Brian has a claim or not. Okay, so let's talk about our decision. What should we do with Brian? Fire Brian? Anybody think we should fire him? No? Final written warning? No discipline? Something in between, something less, more maybe a written warning, but not a final written warning.
Why is it a final if it's his first offense?
And that's a good point. So, we're in the private sector, for-profit employment. Unless you have a union contract, you're not obligated to, go through any certain disciplinary steps. But in reality, that's kind of what you want to try to do. So if it is a first offense, it seems like it was a consensual relationship. I don't see that there was unlawful harassment here. Maybe just a warning on, hey, you shouldn't be engaged in a relationship with a subordinate on your team, that sort of thing.
Why would you call it a first offense if he really hasn't done anything? It was a consensual.
It was a non-offense, right?
Right.
So the other thing we should consider is, what do your policies say about relationships among employees? Okay. So oftentimes you will have a policy that says, no relationships between direct reports, superior and subordinate. If that is the case here, if they had that policy, he would have been in violation of that policy, right? So that would be a basis for some sort of disciplinary action.
How could we have done more on the investigation side so that we had more information as to, was the firing initially because she had another relationship,
Right.
or Is it really just she's grasping at straws?
Well, and how would we find that out?
That's what I'm wondering.
So one of the ways you would want to investigate and look at things is look at emails, look at company emails between the two. Look at other people on her team who might have assessed her performance. That way you'd be able to tell, okay, is the performance really a separate issue, or is it just Brian wants to get rid of her because she ended a relationship with him?
You did not put on here whether or not she did an investigation on the fire, whether it was officially a firing because she blew two accounts.
Right.
Do we have that information?
Well, that's something you're going to want to look into, right? As part of the investigation, yeah. So, I mean, this is designed to raise all these questions. You're going to want to run down as many loose ends as you can. Unfortunately, as we all know, the practical reality is oftentimes you don't have the luxury of infinite time and trying to nail every single thing down. You can't read every single email and all of that. So sometimes you do have to make decisions with less than complete information. What should we do with Nancy? Should we still fire her for performance? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on whether the performance deficiency is really there.
No.
Discipline Nancy.
Give her Brian's job.
Give her Brian's job. Should we promote her?
No.
Yeah? No, probably not, right? Or should we transfer her? That was her request, right? So, and even if the company does not have a policy, does not have a fraternization policy, and to your point, it might be a good idea to at least not necessarily discipline Brian, but remind him that it's not a great idea to have a relationship with a subordinate employee. Okay, so communicating the result. This is an area where I often see some breakdown and where I often see this leading to an EEOC charge. So what happens a lot of times is HR, whoever's doing an investigation, will do a great, thorough, complete investigation, and they don't find anything. There's no legitimacy to the complaint. Nothing is unlawful. They don't find anything unlawful. And they just kind of close the file without ever telling the person complaining, we didn't find anything, and we've closed our investigation. And the person who complained is sitting there waiting for some result, and maybe a few weeks have gone by, they haven't heard anything, and they just assume, well, the company didn't do anything, didn't do an investigation. So it's always good, even if you don't find any unlawful activity, to keep the person informed of how things are going and what the final result's going to be. So to Nancy, we meet with Nancy with our HR manager there and tell her that you've concluded the investigation. The decision was made to offer her a transfer to another team, so she wouldn't be managed by Brian. Okay, so that was her original request anyway. Seems to be a reasonable outcome under the circumstances. Her performance issues would not be addressed at this time, but you urge her to do a good job, and if there are any problems, she can certainly report them, right? Now, you may or may not agree with whether you should address the performance issues. If they're legitimate performance deficiencies, and she's lost 2 major accounts, you might want to discipline her for that at a minimum. Maybe not fire her for that, but maybe put her on a performance improvement plan. Do something so that it's clear, hey, if this happens again, you're out the door.
Why would you do that?
Why would you do what?
Yeah, because you're basically telling your employees that, you know what, if you bring up one little thing
Right.
that makes us worry about a lawsuit, then you get to be rewarded with another job.
Yeah.
I mean, that's ridiculous. I would have fired her. You're gone. There's no substantiality to your claim.
Right.
I investigated it. I even talked to the president. We feel that this is totally separate from your performance, and you were already getting fired for your performance because of client A and B, and we have documentation from them and other workers, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
You're out.
And I'm totally fine with that outcome as long as you have the evidence that the performance issues had no relationship to the relationship. No relation to the relationship involving Brian, right? I mean, maybe Brian was keeping her from doing her work by, their relationship, and that's why there were performance issues. She didn't return calls to those 2 clients or something like that. You know, so you need to make sure under the circumstances that's appropriate. She's happy with the result. Great. So, communicating the result to Brian. You meet with Brian with your HR manager, tell him Nancy has agreed to be transferred to another team. You tell him she's not going to be reprimanded for the performance issues, but if she has issues going forward, they can be dealt with. Again, you got to decide based on the facts whether that's appropriate or whether, you know, maybe she should be reprimanded for the performance issues. You give Brian a final warning and require him to do some harassment training. Again, maybe that's not appropriate here because our investigation essentially found that it was a consensual relationship. So you don't necessarily have to discipline Brian. It wouldn't hurt to do, you know, some additional harassment training. But what you might do is instead of just saying, Brian, you must do harassment training, you could just do it as a team, do it as a whole office, a whole company, that sort of thing. Documentation. What sort of documentation should you have? Notes from the meetings, right? We want to see if you have handwritten notes, fine. If they're not legible, type them up, but keep the copy of those handwritten notes. A summary of the investigation. It's a good idea to kind of summarize what happened, summarize what your decision is and why you made that decision. The why is important because, you know, you will include certain comments about people's credibility, okay? Maybe you found Nancy not to be credible because you think she lied about the photograph. Okay? Written discipline of Brian, if you did decide that route, then you would have that in his file. Same with Nancy if you decided to do anything with her. Proof of the revisited harassment training. So let's say you do send Brian to harassment training, you're going to want, you know, a sign-in sheet or something showing that he completed it. But it might be a good idea to do the whole team or something like that, in which case you'd have an attendance sheet for everybody. Did you have your hand? No, I'm just stretching. Oh, yeah.
I'm looking at Brian a little differently. I think of him as a senior VP with 30 years experience, and this is a major distraction from all the production and productivity. And so I would probably vote for some type of a disciplinary action on Brian, because of just the fact of his position.
Right.
There may be, of course, in the handbook, there may be lots of things about workplace conduct. Maybe that's fraternization, but needless to say, because of his position.
Right.
And he could have invited someone else from his sales team on that trip instead of a 28-year-old. Well, so I'm looking at that going, wait a second. If I have to be involved in the investigation, I'm not really happy with Brian.
Well,
No, I've right. 30 years of time with a company.
Right.
With a 28-year-old.
Well, and you're right, it might be, so it might come back to the fact, hey, Brian's the senior VP on this team. If they've lost 2 accounts, that's on him too, not just on Nancy.
I mean, what happened
Did
when
he not
halfway
train
into
her
the first
properly?
account lost?
The keyword is major account, so he would have been involved.
You're right, that's a good point. So whether you have a fraternization policy or not, there may be, you know, reason based on your policies or just based on, hey, this demonstrates poor management on your part. And so for that reason, we're going to take some remedial action for that. Not because we think there's harassment, but because we think, hey, you really slipped up in managing the situation, managing these major accounts. And that's a perfectly a legitimate basis to do something involving Brian. Okay? So, are you out of the woods yet? Never.
Probably not.
Never out of the woods.
300 days.
So she still could file an EEOC charge, even though you know, did what she asked you to do and even disciplined Brian and made him go to harassment training. She could still file an EEOC charge within 300 days of the incident. Now, if it's an ongoing harassment, it's 300 days from the most recent incident. But your response to the EEOC is going to be, hey, we conducted a thorough and complete investigation. We reached a reasonable conclusion. We imposed appropriate discipline where needed. We did what we had to do as the employer, okay? And that is your obligation. You know, you're not trying to come up with a specific right answer. It's, did you take appropriate remedial action under the circumstances? Was transferring Nancy retaliation for her making a complaint? Could that be seen as retaliatory?
She asked for it.
If she asked for it, probably not. You would have a good defense to retaliation. Let's say she didn't ask for it. Let's say you asked her the question, what's a fair outcome, and she said Brian should be fired, and you decide to transfer her as the result. Could that be seen as retaliatory? So retaliation is adverse employment action based on engaging in a protected activity. The phrase adverse employment action under the retaliation statute of Title VII is much broader than just we fired the person or we reduced their pay. It also includes things like, hey, on this new team she has different duties. Maybe she's not seen as, you know, being at the same level that she was on Brian's team. Maybe, you know, she's not being allowed to work on similarly, you know, lucrative accounts, things like that.
Can you avoid that if she said, well, I want him to be fired and you decide to transfer her, if you meet with her before just transferring her and say, this is what we want to do, are you okay with this? Is this acceptable? And she says yes, then you're a little bit more protected.
It kind of covers the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, you can certainly do that. You know, but if she sticks to her guns and says, no, that's not acceptable, I want Brian fired. But at the end of the day, you have to make the decision as the employer, right, based on the facts. You don't have to do what she wants you to do. You don't have to do what Brian wants you to do. Continuing violation if there's further harassment. So let's say Brian can't keep to himself, and even though she's on another team, he, you know, sends her text messages or calls her or something like that. Well, that just kicks that 300-day timeline out further and further, and she could bring a harassment claim at any time while he's engaging in that type of activity. Is Brian a known risk now? Okay. Let's say now that Nancy's off his team, you hire somebody else for Brian's team and he does the same thing. Does this expose you to more liability, potentially? Not necessarily, because if you took appropriate action the first time around, then you're not going to be seen as, hey, you knew he had a propensity to do this, and so you should never put another woman on his team. Well, you know, that is going to bite you in another way, right? So, you know, the sort of, this is the dog bite rule. It's if you know your dog has a propensity to bite people, and it does bite someone, you're strictly liable as opposed to just negligent. So you know, does this create additional risk under this circumstance? Probably not. But let's say you did find that he unlawfully harassed her, and then you put, you know, someone else on the team who he harasses. That might be an issue. But you also have 30 years of history of him not doing anything.
That you know about.
Right, that we know about. That no one's complained about. And that's all we're obligated to put forward.
What about her also doing the same? I'm going to look at it both ways. What happens? She goes to another department and does the same thing.
And says, I had a relationship with this supervisor or manager.
Complains about some kind of harassment again, or you...
It could happen, yeah, and you would look into it just like any other. You would investigate it, and if it seems like you know, there's nothing there, then certainly her credibility is going to be ruined as far as, you know, anything
But also if she's performing now, you know, that comes up again.
Right.
And because of no, she's not performing, then.
Yeah. So ways to mitigate future risk. Following up with Nancy, seeing how things are going.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I think that should have metrics.
Right, and so that's why you might put her on a performance improvement plan.
Exactly.
And say, hey, you know, we're not ignoring these performance issues. We're going to put you on a performance improvement plan. We want to see certain benchmarks met over the next 90 days or something like that. Yep. Keep an eye on Brian. You know, who knows if we need to do that. It might have been just a one-time thing, but hopefully he doesn't do anything like that again. Training, you know, good idea to train the team, the company as a whole, that sort of thing. Any other questions that anybody has? Yeah.
How long should your timeline be? Like, what's unreasonable?
For what?
The investigation.
Oh, so, you know, there's no hard and fast rule. It just depends on how much you need to investigate. You know, if we're just talking about two individuals here, you have Nancy and you have Brian, there were no other witnesses, a day or two at the most. You know, there's no reason it should take much longer than that. One thing you could do, and so this didn't come up, but this is something that might come up in this situation. What do you do with Nancy in the meantime, right?
Can you, like,
should you put her
suspend
on,
her or whatever?
yeah, or put her on administrative leave or something? You know, what you might do that with both. So Nancy, if you just do it with Nancy, she can say, well, that's retaliation. You know, why are you not letting me work on accounts just because I made a complaint?
Because we were gonna fire you initially.
Right. Yeah. So if you do that, she doesn't mess around.
Black and white.
So if you do administrative leave, it might be a good idea to do that with both of them. You know, if it's only going to take you a day or two to complete your investigation, that's perfectly reasonable. But if you have other witnesses, I mean, let's say Nancy said, oh yeah, so-and-so and so-and-so saw this happen, and you know, they saw me in the hallway trying to end it with him, and he kept pleading, you know, with me, and you're going to have to interview a few other people. It might take a few days. You know, if it's a pervasive issue, let's say Nancy isn't the only one who complains. Let's say she complains, and then while you're investigating Nancy's complaint, you get another complaint from another female employee about Brian. You know, that could happen. I've seen that happen before. So, you know, in that sort of scenario, you would definitely put Brian on some sort of administrative leave. Take the time to investigate everything. Any other questions? No? All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Finished right on time. I appreciate you coming.
Thank you.
All right.